Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about technical writing for professional presentations, research funding, or publications. And specifically we'll be talking about different types of presentations, abstracts, how to write them, and kind of their purpose, research proposals, and just kind of research papers in general and different aspects of research papers. And at the end, your assignment will be to write an abstract, so just keep that in mind as we go throughout today. So just a couple outcomes. First, to enhance proposal writing skills, and second, to prepare for your technical writing final project. So first we'll start with abstracts, and specifically preparing abstracts for conferences. So an abstract is essentially just a summary of the study that you've conducted or that you're about to conduct. So this can be before you actually go through the whole experiment, or it can be after, just kind of depending on what you're using the abstract for. So it's usually located at the beginning of journal articles, to kind of give a summary of what your findings are. It can be used at conferences, both in submitting to conferences to be able to get a presentation, or just when you're actually presenting, so that people have an idea of what to expect when they're attending your presentation. They're also used as part of a grant funding proposal, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The purpose is ultimately to just convey to your audience your research purpose and the process that you went about or you are going to use in order to come to a conclusion. When it comes to conference planners, it's to help convince them about your merit and why they should accept you for their conference. And ultimately to draw people into your work, to get them interested, and to want them or get them to want to read more into what you did. So how are abstracts used in conferences? We talked about this a little bit, but there are two main types of presentations, and you'll see some variations of this. But there's an oral presentation as well as a poster, and sometimes you'll get to choose whether you want to submit specifically for one or the other. Sometimes you don't, and they'll assign you one. But there are a few differences obviously between the two. For an oral presentation, it's typically a 10 to 15 minute talk, essentially, with you'll often have the opportunity to use a PowerPoint to go along with your presentation as a visual aid, and you'll go through the process of presenting your research, introducing it, and talking about your findings as well. A poster presentation is a little bit different, because you're assigned to stand with your poster throughout your session that you're assigned to, and people will just come and walk by, ask you questions about your research, or ask you to kind of summarize what you found. So it's a little bit less formal that way, because you're just kind of engaged more in a discussion about your research. But both have their pros and cons. So how are abstracts selected? Reviewers for conferences or journals may consider multiple factors, including the value of the topic to the conference, and the link to the theme of the conference. So does it really fit with what they're really trying to make a theme? The quality of the work, obviously, the clarity of the abstract, and the novelty of the idea or research being presented. So just a few things to think about as you prepare to write a conference abstract. What do I have to present in the time frame allowed? Is this relevant to the audience this conference targets? So is it timely? Is it provocative? And is it important? Does my topic relate to the theme of the conference? Do I have enough to share something new or novel and meet audience needs? So is there anything, what am I providing by giving this presentation? And what are the outcomes for the presentation? So this is kind of maybe obvious and overstated, but definitely something to keep in mind, to always follow the rules of your specific conference or journal, because they will have different specifications for your abstract. So this could be anything from font, the title length, body length, and just make sure that you don't lose the interest of reviewers because you did something silly. All right, so just a few parts of an abstract. Obviously, there's the title, author, affiliations, and address, and then kind of the main sections of the writing that you actually think about is introduction. So this is the foundation for your research. It provides some background to where you're coming from and what sparked kind of the ideas and kind of your purpose in conducting the study. So this is, leads into the purpose and hypothesis, so what you expect. Your methods, which is how you conducted the study. Your results, which will contain principal findings of your research, and a conclusion discussion where you discuss the success of your hypothesis and what the findings mean relative to the audience that you're targeting. So sometimes conferences and journals will ask you to specifically outline and label each of these sections. Other times they won't, but either way you want to make sure that you address each of these sections. Just a few pieces of writing advice, which some of you probably are very familiar with, but oftentimes you want to write long and pare down, so you want to be able to trim down your writing instead of having to feel like you are adding this fluff just to get to a word limit. Analyze one sentence at a time. Make sure that every sentence has purpose and that they flow together, because you aren't going to have much space in an abstract and in a paper to really get across your message. Ask for peer review prior to submission, and it's often good to have multiple people, one to review content and one to review grammar, spelling, punctuation, and flow. It's also important to just consider writing tense conventions, and just to make sure that you're consistent throughout your paper. So we use present tense when quoting previously published work and past tense when describing your own study. And there are just a few examples there. So as we go through each parts of the abstract and the just what each of them contains, I would suggest maybe just having an abstract that you find either on Google Scholar or on the Harold B. Lee Library website database, and just try and identify each of these parts as we go through, because that'll just kind of help you contextualize what all of this means and kind of what it looks like in real life. So starting with the title, the length and text style are determined by the conference or journal, as we mentioned earlier. And optimally, this is identical to your paper title, the full-length paper. So this is just a brief summary of research, and just make sure to include the idea and context of your work, just to give readers a good idea of what it's going to be about and what they can expect. And it's also just a word of advice to write the title after your abstract is written, so you have just your ideas on paper and format your title around your research instead of formatting your summary of your research around the title. So an introduction or background, usually fairly short, as all these sections will be, but just a few questions to consider as you write the introduction. What specific need or problem does your research address? How was the need identified, and what is its significance? Who will benefit from the proposed research project? And what are the research questions or objectives of the proposal? And there should be a question mark here. Project research questions. So list research questions or objectives. Oftentimes this is short and just one sentence, clear, concise, and to the point. You don't really need to add a lot of fluff here, but it should be action-oriented, relate to identified needs that you identified in your introduction, and that kind of makes the transition to your methods section. So it kind of connects your introduction to the methods, and really just is kind of the PowerPoint or the power sentence of where you're wanting to focus on, what your research is really attempting to address. So your methods section, specifically the question to address is how did you or will you conduct the research and gather information, findings. So this is where you talk about the subject, so how many people were in your study or are going to be in your study. What kind of population did you use? Was it an elderly population? Was it in children? Was it undergraduates at BYU? Those are all important things to identify. The design, so the type of design used, was it longitudinal or was it cross-sectional? Did you use a survey? All those things, which leads into data collection. So what information did you collect and how did you collect it? And this is also maybe not in your abstract, but in your paper, this is where you'll identify the different types of tools or instruments that you used. Your results section, this also should be pretty short, clear, concise, and to the point. What did you find out? Really just in your abstract you want to include the most important data that influence your conclusion. So you don't want to give all of your results of all your surveys and all the questions that you asked, but you can include mean values, the significance, standard deviations, so some of those statistics that are really important to your conclusion and your findings and what you're kind of wanting to get across. Conclusion discussion. Really, again, just state your most important information here. How did your hypothesis turn out? What does your work mean? What's the big take-home point? And it's usually 1 to 2 sentences. Bibliography. This is sometimes included in your abstract. Oftentimes it's not, but it will be important, obviously, in your paper, and important that you, again, follow formatting rules and just make sure that you document every source that you use. Just a few points of kind of checking through your abstracts, things to think about. Does the abstract capture interest for a good idea? Is it well written? Is it title catchy? And describe what you're studying. Does the purpose statement clearly address a significant problem? To describe how the research is being undertaken. What's the importance of the material? Is it a good fit for the conference? And does it conform with conference requirements? So just things to consider as you write your abstracts. We're going to move on to talking a little bit about research proposals. So oftentimes when you are preparing to conduct a study, you'll need funding to either pay, participants or to buy materials that you'll need for the study. And so you'll need to submit proposals to grants to get that funding. In those proposals, we have a summary or an abstract with all the parts that we just talked about. A review of the literature, what's already been studied to make sure that you're, again, contributing something that's novel. Your methodology that you're going to use, data analysis, how you're going to analyze what you collect, and bibliography as well. And then you're going to talk a little bit to your organizational capability, the timeline, when you expect to complete the project, as well as budget and cost effectiveness, which we'll go into a little bit later, and you'll include appendices as well. Just a few points of a good funding proposal. It starts with a good idea. It's carefully researched. It matches the sponsor's priorities, so you're kind of conforming to what the sponsor is looking for, and kind of adapting your research to fit that need. Follows guidelines carefully, and just describes the important parts of the research. So budget and cost effectiveness. It's important first and foremost just to be realistic about your budget. Inflating your budget can hurt your chances of being funded because the sponsor may not want to dedicate that much funding to it. Budgeting too low is obviously going to make your project come to a point where you run out of funds, which you don't want either. So just estimate your costs as accurately as possible, and just explain how you arrived at those figures, how the money's going to be used, and kind of a timeline for that as well. So timeline is just a way of illustrating each phase of the research project. When are you going to be collecting data from participants? When are you going to be analyzing that data? And when are you going to be writing and submitting your research? So those are all points to consider. The proposal cycle illustrated here as we write proposals. Either they can be funded right away, which is great. They can be declined, which often happens, but that's okay. Just submit. You can submit elsewhere, revise, think about maybe there's a better fit for what you're looking for, and rewrite and submit again. Just a few mistakes to be aware of. Easy to avoid. Not following directions, formatting, not allowing enough time, and just not including all of the information up front that will help reviewers to identify kind of where your project's at, where it's going. So yeah. All right. We're just going to go through a few questions real quick here, and then we'll talk about our assignment. All right. So the good scientific paper. Sorry, this is poorly timed, but A is focused on a specific question. So we want it to be as specific as possible and not to be broad, because it's much harder to really learn a lot about a specific topic when our question is broad. So the answer here is A. We want abstracts, tables that are understandable without reading the whole paper. So we just want a summary that's concise and it's easy as people just glance and scan over your abstract, that they get a good sense of what your research is, and whether or not it's applicable to what they're looking for or wanting to learn about. So we want writing that's in an active voice versus passive. So we definitely want, as you write, and this can be hard to do, and it might become repetitive after a while, but it's important that when you use a term defined in the methods section, that it's used in the same form and again, so that it's just consistent. Readers can understand and know what you're referring to without having to go back and forth throughout your paper. So as mentioned before, we want the writing to be concise, and generally the shorter the better, and that's kind of the best form of persuasion in technical writing. All right, so your take-home assignment that we mentioned, building from your research plans in the annotated bibliography assignment, select one of the two following options, so you don't have to do both, to write an appropriate professional abstract. So you can either do a conference abstract, which the directions are outlined here, or you can do a Cura funding abstract. And the Cura is BYU's College Undergraduate Research Awards, and you can find more information about that online. So choose one of those, and then the grading rubric is here. Good luck.